All right, welcome back. We are WEBD6201 in the winter 2021 semester and client-side scripting at Durham. And it's week 4, part 1 of our broadcast for this one. We're going to do another one tomorrow. Let's talk about a couple things. So last week, where were we? We did deploying live to GitHub pages. We talked about ECMAScript, what that is, and how it is kind of the standard that JavaScript and other languages are based on. The evolution of JavaScript, ES5 versus ES6 syntax. We did those kind of things. And we also talked about splitting code over multiple files, using local storage to create a contact list. And we also had lab 1 that is scheduled. We talked about this last week, scheduled to be due this week. So Friday at midnight. Hopefully you guys have had a chance to work on it. It's a couple days away. So we're sitting at Wednesday right now, as of this recording. And it'd be nice to have, have this completely done for you guys. It should be fairly straightforward. This week we're going to be talking about what Jquery is, what kind of Jquery features, what they are, what's the content delivery network. We'll probably start with this today. We'll start with some Jquery programming today, and we'll hit more tomorrow. And again, this week we have lab 1 that's due Friday at midnight. ICE 3, I pushed it to Saturday this time around just because your lab 1 is due Friday, just to make sure that everything is good. I've also released lab 2, which is due week 7. It sounds like kind of far away, but yeah, it's just right around the corner, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So we're sitting at week 4, my week 4, your potentially week 5 and some other courses. And we're kind of hurtling towards the mid-semester break, which is February 22nd to the 26th for you guys, which is pretty cool. I'm sure you're looking forward to a bit of a break, even if it's just a break from classes and the ability for you to catch up on some stuff for some of you, or even just relax if you can. So we have notice every week after this week, next week, and so on, it's all Jquery all the way until week 7, which is your week 8. So it says Jquery all the way, and that's what's on the schedule. However, what I'm going to be doing, of course, is adding additional content to prepare you for the last part of the semester, which is Node.js. So I'll probably hit some of that and Ajax a little bit earlier, only because lots of stuff is happening. Just as an aside, most of you did very well on the test that was hosted last week, and there's going to be another test in a couple weeks before the mid-semester break, and that test is going to be all around Jquery for the most part, right? So we've covered Jquery, covered Jquery, and we're going to continue to cover Jquery until it's time. Right after Jquery, we're going to hit Ajax, but I'm probably going to introduce Ajax a little early, like I said, because I want to get into what's happening with that. And you can see that test number 3 is scheduled for week 8, as an example. Theoretically, it should be the week after. So you can expect that I'm probably going to push up content for Ajax up until week 7 or even earlier. And the reason for this is because test 3, if I'm not wrong, it's all around Ajax, right? So it's hard to test you on it when you haven't really talked about it. And then, excuse me, as we continue doing everything, the last test, like we said before, is on Node.js and all that kind of stuff, and that's scheduled for our week 12, your week 13. All right, so that is kind of looking forward a little bit. And before we get into the content of today, I wanted to share with you the new lab that has been released. Let's get into that really quickly. And so you have all the lab details as well for the next one. Now this one, just like the last lab, the one that's due Friday, I think is, again, very reasonable, very straightforward. let's bring that up. So it's jQuery, of course, and form validation. So the labs kind of help you in many ways to kind of work on the tests and everything else. And the ICE in class exercise, they work on helping you with labs. So they kind of all work. That's the idea, that they work together to try and help you learn JavaScript. And I see one of the notes I'm seeing on chat is like, I really like how powerful JS is, but boy, does it have a learning curve. That's Nick's comment. And I agree. I mean, if you've never done JavaScript before, or if you've really done just a scratching the surface JavaScript, then this can be really different for you, especially if you're used to a very structured language. And jQuery is might confuse some people because it's a lot of shorthand. So let's talk about what this assignment's all about. So lab 2 is jQuery and form validation. That's what it's about. And what I'm going to get you guys to do is create 2 pages, a login page and a register page, right? The login page and the register page are going to look like this, right, as an example. And then you're going to get some marks for, well, you could, sorry, Nick is asking, will lab 2 be built off of lab 1? You could certainly use lab 1 as a structure, because you can see that there's a lot of stuff that's very similar to lab 1. So you could totally do that. You could say, okay, I've got my lab 1 working, and now I'm going to add lab 2. I'm totally fine with that if you were going to do that. Or you can use one of, if I give you a sample in an in-class exercise, you want to base it off that, that's fine, because I'm only going to be looking at some things, not everything. So again, if you notice login, there's a login page and there's also a register page. These pages are going to be semi-functional. And I mean that, like, you won't really be able to log in right now because one of the challenges that you'll have when it comes to logging in and registering is that there is no back end. We've only got a front end, right? So we can create a mock login and log out, and we'll talk about that over the coming weeks as we'll use session storage for this kind of stuff. So we'll say login, we can check to see if your login matches a file as an example that we logged, like, again, we're just mocking it up from using Ajax. And then once you log in, and you can check to see that it matches with the information, or even not even a file, it could be just a hard-coded array of data or an object. As long as it matches with that information, then you can log in. Registering is another matter. It's hard to register and actually save data anywhere except for local storage, as an example. So when you register, what we're going to do is we're probably going to register and submit your data on either session storage or local storage. And then what we can do is we can log in based on what we see. And again, this is just mocking up what it's like, because we obviously we don't have a backend right now. But eventually, we're going to use the same forms, the same pages that we make for this lab for future labs, because what you're doing is you're building on some of the, the things we're talking about here. Now, these pages will probably look a lot different after this lab, because you're going to design something like this. Does it have to be and Arvin's asking if this shows up in local storage, are we good? Yeah, we'll talk about this in a second. So the login page is going to be based on some of your registration information eventually. But for this lab, I'm not actually going to get you guys to log in and register. If you notice, the login page is using only JavaScript and jQuery. When the user enters a username and password and then clicks the login button, whether you don't even have to check. There's no checks to see if the person is like registered or anything. I'm not going to get you guys to do that here at this point. Just insert their username between the contact us link and the login logout link, which is something that you're going to have to create in the nav bar. So up here above, I've probably said you need to have a bit of a different structure, and the reason for this is because you can see clearly that there's additional pages here. And you're probably going to have some kind of login or logout page at the top. So those are the 2 pages that you're going to include in your navigation. All right. So again, I'm going to clarify this as we move forward. So that's one thing. So there's going to be on your navigation, you're going to have a kind of a login or a logout. And the login logout is going to swap or change according to if you're logged in or logged out. I'm gonna show you how to do that. We can look at session storage to see if the person is logged in. So in other words, their information has been stored in session storage, and then like as in the username. And if the username is there, the user, then what we can do is we can hide the login link and only show the logout link. So that's something we can do. We can kind of look at the page and say, all right, when the page loads, do I have a user? Yes or no? And if I have a user, show the logout link. If I don't have a user, show the login link. Okay, those are the things we can do. Register pages, what you're going to be doing is there's several, when I say register page and I see it over and over again, it's different pieces of the register page. So you can see that there's more work that I'm asking you to do on the register page than on the login page. Login page just gets you to do a little form, and when you log in, you're going to show that you're logged in at the top of your nav bar. That's really all it does. But the register page is a little bit more challenging to put together. And again, this is all prep for what's going to happen later on this semester when we have additional challenges coming your way because of Node.js, as well as Express. We're going to learn about Express, the middleware, and everything else that's coming your way near the end of semester. So the register page, again, you're going to, when you register, you're going to use this error message thing. And the error message is something similar that I've already shown you because we've already done the error message in our contact page. It's going to be the same thing. You're going to produce a little hidden error message link. You can kind of use the same structure that we use in our contact page for this. And when the person is having an issue, they can get 10 free marks for just adjusting that pretty much, or adding a error message div tag that's hidden. And then with a little bit of JavaScript or jQuery, you want to show it. I say only JavaScript and jQuery. For this assignment, obviously, I'm looking for jQuery. Okay, so JavaScript, because there's going to be a little bit of JavaScript, because you can't do everything with jQuery. For example, you can't do a for loop necessarily all with jQuery. You can, but there's some stuff that you can't do just with jQuery. You need to use a little bit of JavaScript as well. So that's why I said JavaScript and jQuery, but primarily jQuery is what I'm looking for in this assignment. And same thing with the register page where it says using only JavaScript and jQuery, ensure when the user enters the first name and last name that the minimum length, so we do some little bit of validation here, that each input element will allow is 2 characters. We've kind of done that already in our contact page. So it's very similar to what you're doing here. You're just going to be tested on it. I'm asking you to implement it in a different page, the register page, as an example, a different form. And then using only JavaScript and jQuery when the user enters their email address, make sure that the minimum length is 8 and that the @ symbol is present. And if the user violates this check, then show the error message, which is what's going to happen. So we always show error messages. And then the same thing goes with the password and confirm password. Make sure that the elements match, as well as they must be a minimum of 6 characters in length. Again, we're not going to do any fancy checking in terms of uppercase, lowercase, all that stuff right now because everything is so new. When they press the register button, we want to prevent default behavior. You should know how to prevent default behavior at this point. We're going to create a user class that you're going to store all the stuff in as opposed to a contact class. And then the register page, what you're going to be doing is you're going to basically show everything on the console and then finally clear the form. So that way, we can show that you've registered a user, you have the user data. I'm not going to force you to put this on or in the lab on local storage. I'm actually making the lab a little easier than the in-class exercises, only because I want you guys to get the flow of how to do stuff again for lab 2. All right, and internal documentation the same, GitHub stuff the same, cloud provider the same. You got to put it up on live on GitHub pages or something else, and then your short video is all the same. So it's out of 100. Again, 65% of your marks are functionality. 10 is site structure because at the end of the day, I've asked you to put some, your structure together. You're going to add a couple more pages, so you need to follow that. And that's really it. I don't think it's a very difficult lab at all. Again, and you and your partner to get this done, I think it's really straightforward. I think it should be no problem to get it done. So that is due, again, just to reiterate, it's due way out March 5th. So we have about a month real time to get it done, and so that it spaces out nicely. You have a chance to to do some practice with Jquery before that time to make sure everything works properly. And we're going to start with Jquery today. Any questions around Lab 2, which is really like your assignment 2? All right, let's move from here. So I'm just going to close this one down. So that is Lab 2. And let's move into the next part, which is Jquery. I'm going to start talking about Jquery, kind of at a very high level, and then we'll move into some more details in a sec. So what is Jquery? Jquery is, like we talked about before, a JavaScript library. It was created a long time ago, right? So it wasn't something that's been out only recently. It's been out quite a while ago. And what it did, like I mentioned before, is, if I go to, let's go to Jquery, jquery.com, where this thing is hosted. You can see that even the page itself is not really striking. And I mean, it hasn't changed much in a very long time. It's very old school, the way it's kind of in this format in the middle, and so on. And however, Jquery is still very much used out there. And the reason why is because of people's knowledge of JavaScript is still, just like we mentioned earlier, still quite low. There's a lot of code out there, especially on Stack Overflow and other places, that shows quick and easy ways to use Jquery. And it really is a shortcut, if you will, to doing a lot of the more complex functions that you would rather otherwise do with JavaScript. So that's why it's there. Jquery was created for the most part to bridge the gap between someone who is a programmer in other languages, and someone who is a designer, someone who's on the front end, who knows how to make HTML, create HTML pages, and use CSS, so structure and presentation, those two layers, but are really not great with JavaScript, because JavaScript, for some people back in the day, even for now, looks like spaghetti code. You look at it and you're like, wow, this is so different, and wouldn't it be nice if I could do some of the same things I do with CSS? Why is JavaScript so different than everything else, and so on? That's where Jquery came from, which is good. And so what it does is, as you can see, you're going to have some kind of shorthand, a $sign. The $sign itself is like saying, hey, Jquery, I need to use you, kind of thing. And then you're calling upon Jquery to do something with you. And one thing that it does really great, and this is a brief look here, is it does DOM traversal and manipulation. We're going to talk about this. Event handling makes event handling super easier. And also where it really helps is Ajax. Okay, and Ajax, you kind of think about this as asynchronous access. Normally it was called asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Now we just call it Ajax because it's not XML. Most of the time it's JSON data that we have on the back end, not XML, right? Because XML is kind of an older standard that it's still out there, but we use JSON a lot of times for JavaScript. So that is kind of the three main things that it does. There's several other things we can look at here. The API documentation is okay. Again, I think it could be organized better. But again, you got to see this project is a legacy project that's been in place for a long, long time. So it tells you what you can do with these things as an example. But there is no real, if you look through here, there's no apparent guide on doing stuff. But if you want to do something, let's say, for example, I need to do form validation, I can click on forms, and then it tells you the methods of doing some forms, which is pretty cool. So this is some of the stuff it gives you, and there's some kind of good functions that it gives you as well. It also has, if I go on the left, where I say Ajax, it shows you Ajax functions. So there's some organization. but it would be nice if there was kind of getting started and all that stuff that we see in modern API pages, right? So there's also, well, there used to be a bit of a blog, and you can see that this was last released May 4th. So May the 4th be with you back in 2020. And this is pretty cool. And it talks about that they're still working on improving jQuery. And they've done a bunch of different things here. It talks about how they're going to continue to evolve everything. Again, it would just be nice if they had maybe a little bit more funding or something so that the page would look nicer and the API documentation would be more modern, right? But that is definitely there. There's lots of plugins that come with jQuery, so there's tons and tons of this. And you can see that there's hundreds of different kinds of plugins, everything from different form plugins. If you want to make a UI spinner, you can take a look at what the spinner would look like and so on, and who contributed to it. So a ton of spinners or UIs. You can see when it was done. This is 2014. And they even have a little bit of demo, and you can read the documentation on this one and how it works. Jquery Ui is very interesting. So you have jQuery as the main project, and Jquery UI is kind of a secondary project they came up with. And at the time, again, creating user interface elements, there wasn't, Bootstrap didn't exist, Font Awesome didn't exist. And none of those front-end frameworks existed. Even Angular or all those other new modern frameworks didn't exist. So if I wanted to do an accordion, like something that looks like this with JavaScript, it could be quite challenging to do. So jQuery provided something like this. And when accordions were, in fashion, right now I would say accordions are out of fashion. I don't think we see a lot of accordion type of user interface items in modern web pages. We don't see this kind of stuff. And the same thing goes with, buttons. I mean, buttons, the way they're done today, we've added button as a JavaScript element. And before, back in the day, there wasn't any buttons. They didn't exist. And so they were just anchor tags. And so with HTML5, they added buttons. And you can see like that's how old jQuery is. It predates HTML5. It goes way back before HTML4 even. And so it's kind of survived several versions, of changes over the years, right? And it's continuing here now in 2021. So it's not like it's a dead project. It's just not as in fashion to use jQuery anymore as it used to be. So date pickers, dialogues, all these things are kind of the basis for a lot of other projects. And that's one thing that jQuery provided us. It provided a jump off point or, kind of a springboard to create other front-end frameworks. And one of the ones that it created helped create was Angular, right? So this is Angular. It's a modern front-end framework. And we've maybe talked about this before, but this is one of the letters of the mean stack, MongoDB, Express. We talked about these last week. MongoDB being a JavaScript database type with no SQL. Express is middleware, which allows us to create things like routing, and it even allows you to do front end, kind of views. And it does help us with separation of concerns. So it does creates that whole MVC structure, model view controller I spoke about briefly last week. And Angular is the third letter, mean, Mongo Express Angular, and then the back end Node.js, right? So this is pretty cool. Angular is super powered. It does a lot of stuff for you on the front end. It creates, if you want to make a modern application, right, a web application, and if this is made by developers for developers. It is, if you think JavaScript is a learning curve, Angular has a learning curve. So, and one of the things that makes it challenging to adopt is because it uses TypeScript, and it has a very it's a very opinionated structure. So it's a framework. It is not a library like, for example, React. So if I look at React, and here's React.js. So if I go to reactjs.org, React is another front-end framework that originally was kind of based off of the ideas of jQuery, right? So jQuery React does things differently than Angular in that it's not a framework, but rather a library, right? So difference between a framework and a library. Framework, you need to have a structure. You need to follow, to do everything that the framework tells you to do. And if you don't, then it won't work for you. It's not something that it's strongly coupled. All the pieces are strongly coupled together, and you need to kind of create things in a certain, certain way. Whereas a library, it's like loosely coupled, and you can plug in pieces of the library where you need it, right? And then, ignore some of the other stuff that's part of the library. So React is declarative, right? Which is a lot different than other languages, other front-end frameworks. Like Angular is not really declarative so much as React. React basically says here, I want to build something. I want to build a component, as an example, which is a kind of a hello component or whatever, a hello name, a simple component. And then I can plug that component in, as an example, in different places. So that is, kind of how the, React works. We build components and we plug them into different parts of our page. We inject HTML through, by using a shadow DOM or a virtual DOM, document object model. And, and so we use classes and objects like this, but we have something called JSX, and JSX is kind of it's optional, like it says, but what it does is it allows us to create almost like template strings that we can inject into our page, which is kind of interesting. So that's what React does. And then the other one is Vue Js. Vue Js is kind of a departure from some of the other ones. Again, it's been released, like you can see here, the initial release was 2014 as an example, and now it's been 6 years for Vue Js as well. Again, I would say kind of newer framework, library. It's still a library. It's not, they say it's a framework, but I really believe you can use Vue Js more like a library. A little bit more opinionated in some ways than React, but it's if you look at the getting started guide as an example for Vue Js, it's really not that different. The only thing that it is we use something like handlebars. That's what these look like, or mustaches. So double curly braces are considered mustaches or handlebars. Sometimes you look at them like that. And these double handlebars or mustaches are where we inject data. So we can use this, in kind of an element, and we can, we have our front end, which is HTML, and we have our back end where we create our structure. So we have almost like our code behind file, very similar to React. And then it does usually use something called reactive programming. So we use, again, more declarative as opposed to imperative programming. And it injects stuff into the page similar to what React does. So those are the three big ones. New kid on the block is Svelte. Svelte, if you go to svelte.dev, again, it's one thing that they kind of talk about is there's no virtual DOM. They move away from virtual DOM altogether, which is very different than what React or even or Angular or Vue Js does, right? Because these are all front-end frameworks or front-end libraries. Again, this is interesting in that it's minimalist code. So again, you have your script as an example, and you want to inject something like this, where you can have a little script tag, and then it injects it here inside, like we're using some kind of handlebars equivalent or curly braces. It can inject it almost like a template string. I mean, that's how easy it is, and it's really straightforward to use Svelte. The challenge with Svelte right now, even though it's kind of like an up-and-coming front-end API or JavaScript library, the problem with it is I still think that at the time of this recording and the broadcast we're doing today, it allows you to use TypeScript, which is pretty cool. It is very easy to learn. I think the learning curve is not that great. But the challenge is that if when you run into trouble with Svelte, and if you're trying to do something that is not documented in the API, support right now for Svelte is not the same. Not yet. It's getting there. It's getting much better than, let's say, Vue, React, or Angular. So those are the top libraries or JavaScript frameworks. Okay, so that's kind of where we are. Why am I talking about this again? Because we're talking about jQuery, because jQuery started it all. jQuery started off and said, let's make JavaScript easier. And one thing to note for Angular, from a support perspective, and this is why some people love and hate Angular, and between the two, Angular and React, I would say React is now the more popular library. It's surpassed Angular in popularity. Originally, Angular was very popular. It was awesome what you can do. It was created by Microsoft and Google in kind of collaboration, and it uses TypeScript everywhere and all that kind of stuff. But it's run by Google, right? So Google is the chief in terms of owning it. But Microsoft supports it from a language background perspective, and it's very much something that you would use in a large scale application framework, maybe as compared to React, right? And this is just as a front end. So pretty cool, lots of power, and it's again, if you're someone who's used to programming with classes and objects and all that kind of stuff, it's still very component based. So as it continues to modernize, it's really cool. But it's the learning curve. The learning curve for Angular and React, more so for Angular, is very, very steep. There's lots of details in the framework. For you to learn how to use Angular, there's like courses and courses on how to do this by yourself. And same thing with React. There's a lot of stuff you can do with React. And earlier, I think it was maybe easier to learn in some ways than Angular, but it's very different. So just because you know Angular doesn't mean you know React. It's like they're two ways, very different things to learn. Again, and jQuery was the kind of the mother of all those things. jQuery is also, the basis of CSS frameworks like Bootstrap. So remember we talked about this semester, Get Bootstrap. Originally, it was dependent on jQuery. One thing we haven't also talked about this semester, but also based largely on jQuery, is other front-end frameworks like Foundation. So Foundation is another front-end framework, CSS framework. So not a HTML and JavaScript framework that allows you to do a lot of things very similar to Bootstrap, very similar. And it has a lot of things like it's still mobile first. All the CSS frameworks and even the JavaScript frameworks are mobile first, even though mobile first maybe is not the way we're doing things right now, because most of us are working remotely during COVID, and you're probably working on a laptop and you're probably working on a desktop, but not maybe as much on your phones anymore or on your tablets. During regular times, I think there's more access from, as much if not more, from a mobile device than it is from a desktop device. But maybe not so now during COVID when we're always at home, right? So maybe we use our phones less to access websites when we have access to our desktops and so on. Again, depending on the user. But most frameworks, and whether it's CSS frameworks or JavaScript frameworks, are mobile first. And again, this was all started by jQuery because they have something called jQuery Mobile, right? So it's jQuery Mobile was kind of a project. I think this one has been less updated than everything else. Does it still work to a degree? Would I use jQuery Mobile to create mobile applications? No, not anymore. There's other ones out there that are very good, and one of them is based off of React, which is called React Native. So React Native is not only it's kind of React-like, and I would say this is the leading hybrid mobile device framework nowadays. And I say framework because it is more of a framework than just a library when it comes to making mobile applications. And so imagine instead of me learning how to use to make things native with Android or iOS, then I can make it with JavaScript, and then with React Native, and I can convert it to native-like application. So that is kind of a leading, I would say the leading mobile JavaScript framework. All right, that's how I would say right now, React Native. The other one that's been popular in the past is something called Ionic. And the Ionic framework is also something that's out there. It's more based on, it was more eventually based on Angular, believe it or not. But now, as you can see, it kind of spans different languages. Again, it's a very modern framework that kind of uses any front end to create modern mobile applications. Again, so these are all things that were originally inspired by jQuery. So jQuery is kind of the mother of all these things in some ways, and was required actually for some of this stuff in the beginning. So I would say those are the two leading frameworks for mobile application development, hybrid mobile application development using JavaScript technologies and web technologies. Back to jQuery. So you can see that these three little projects, jQuery being a framework or a JavaScript library to help us make JavaScript easier, Jquery Ui, which inspired projects like Bootstrap and Foundation, and even Angular, and so on, and other things like that, and jQuery Mobile that inspired React Native and maybe other frameworks like Ionic. They were all the beginning, and that's where it all came from, because this is all we had. So you can see the evolution of how things work. So that's why it's important for us to learn jQuery, even though, like I said, there's different ways and maybe better ways now to do the same things. All right, so that is the kind of a little bit of a history, and I wanted to give you that because I know it's sometimes we look at it and say, like, why do we even bother with jQuery? Well, because there's a lot of still things that are pretty good with jQuery. I complain about jQuery too. I'm like, why do I need to use jQuery when I can do everything with JavaScript? But we'll talk about how to do this. All right, so back to this. So that is jQuery. jQuery is as a bit of what is it? You can see that it says more than half of the 10,000 most visited websites today, use jQuery. I'd still say that's true, even though jQuery is not required, right? As an example, jQuery is still kind of the #1 backend, or some, because it's all over the place. There's a lot of legacy code out there, and there's still tons of jQuery out there. Should we, keep doing jQuery? I don't know, but it's definitely something that's still out there a lot. From a feature set perspective, it looks like this. You've got your core functionality, which is things like, common functions that jQuery offers. Selection and traversal probably is maybe even #1 when it comes to what jQuery can offer you. It's very CSS-like in terms of the way it selects items, right? So if you remember things like query selector all that we talked about in JavaScript, jQuery looks like you're using query selector all the time. Manipulation and CSS, it helps you with things like CSS data, positioning, all those kind of things. Events, it simplifies it to some degree, but it also, again, it's using the different event model. So it uses .on a lot of times for creating events on click, on whatever the event name is. A lot of effects in terms of animations. This is where jQuery is really good. Timings, fading in, fading out, all that kind of stuff. jQuery is really great at this. Ajax is where it shines. It makes Ajax a lot easier than JavaScript. JavaScript, there's a lot more code to some degree than Ajax. It creates user interface elements like sliders and all those kind of things. You can actually use jQuery to build your own front-end framework just based on jQuery and, let's say, Bootstrap. If you have those two things, you can do a lot. You can make your own Angular. You can make your own libraries from jQuery. And of course, it's extensible because it has a ton of plugins. So how do you do it? Well, there's two places a couple of ways to get it now. In the past, we could download jQuery like we've shown you before. You could use yarn, which is what we've done. And if we look at our structure that we've had in the past, and let's pull that up because we want to start our lab. So we're going to work with, as we go, sorry, a lab, in-class exercise. If we go to GitHub and we go to Durham Programmer, then what we had, I'm going to base our ICE 3B, which is what you're going to be working off of ICE 2B. So let's download ICE 2B. I'm assuming that you are, or you can continue with what you had last week. So we're going to build on what we had. So let's just download ICE 2B. So I'm going to download that. And I'm doing this so I can show you, you know, how we've done it so far. We've kind of been using jQuery from the very beginning. I mean, I've included it in our application from the very beginning. And the reason was because I knew we were going to get there. I knew that at some point we were going to need jQuery. And so that is something that, you know, you're going to notice that is already there inside of your template that we've been working with, because, you know, again, it's actually a dependency for a lot of stuff that we were doing. So here on my desktop, I kind of did it off screen here. I've got my WEBD6201, and that's our ICE 2B. I'm just going to unzip this. So zip, we're going to unzip it, extract it to main. A lot of times whenever you extract a GitHub repo, you're going to get something that looks like this. We've talked about this before. So the name of the repo dash the branch, which is in this case the main branch. We want to rename this thing to week 4B. That's what I'm going to do, because that's what my folder is going to be called. We can call our folder something different than what our project is going to be like online. Here's week 4B, and that's what I'm going to start with. I'm going to start with this one, WEBD6201 ICE 2B, and I'm going to base ICE 3 in class exercise 3 off of this one. All right, so let's bring up VS Code for a second, and I'm just going to drag and drop week 4B in there. All right, sure. And like we said before, in our structure that we have here, if I was to look at it, the only thing we need to really change is this should be in our README file. It should say ICE 3B. This should be ICE 3 for our README file, even though we're in week 4. And what I want to do is put this up on GitHub, but I need to make a GitHub repository. Again, I'm going to be using command line here. Control backtick is going to bring up our little terminal, and I can just do a git init, and then we'll add git add dot, right? And then we'll continue. If I can actually clear git commit, wow, commit -m, and we'll say initial commit. Cool. So that's the first part, those three commands, right? And now what I need is a connection, a remote that connects to our new repository, which we don't have yet. Let's go and make it. So again, I'm going to go back up to Durham Programmer, and I'm going to go and create a new repository. This is for you if you just click in the new button. And when you click the new button, you're going to go here, make sure it's public, again for us, so I can see it. And then you can go in WebD 6201, and then it's in the winter 2021 semester, and it is in class exercise 3B, which is what you guys are, right? And then press enter, and when you do that, you're going to see that it's going to give you steering directions. These last 3 lines of code are what we want, so I'm going to copy them. And this is just telling you that the branch that you're going to use by default is the main branch, and you're going to add the origin remote, and you're going to make the, whenever I push to the origin remote, we're going to make that the default remote that we're going to use when I say git push. So copy those, and I'll go back in here and right click and paste, and then press enter. And if everything goes well, then we should be able to push everything up to Durham Programmer. All right, and there we go. We have we're ready to go with this. So let's inspect some of the things we had last time. One thing we have is we still have a .node Jekyll file, which is just an empty file that basically tells GitHub pages to ignore, or sorry, to include, not to ignore, node modules. All right, and let's just run that. So if I go light server, just to see where we're at, we can start with this. Here's our light server as an example, and locally. And we had in our contact pages, if I go to inspect, and if I look at our application, you can see that there are several contacts that we've entered through this little contact page, which is not really a contact page, it's almost like a data entry page now. And if I go to show contact list, you should see this. This is where we are last day. If you have stuff that's in the application part of your, when you inspect inside the console, there's different tabs here. I'm looking at application and we're looking at local storage. You can also add your own here. If I go add new, you can actually add a new one. And whatever you add here, once you refresh this page, will appear. So that's something that you can do. As long as you follow the same structure, then when it deserializes your values, it'll bring it into a contact and it'll create a list here that we did last week. All right, so that's kind of what we have. We also talked about last week how to put this up on GitHub pages and how to do that. If this is my repository, this is just a review, because for this Friday for your lab 1 needs to be live. So if I go to settings, the way to do this, and if you scroll down, then you're going to see an area that says GitHub pages, right, under settings. Then you can choose which branch you want to make live, main. Typically, we only have one branch here in this course, but if you have multiple branches, you can choose the branch you want to make live and then click save. And when you do that, it's going to create a deployment. It's going to take some time for that to happen. But if you scroll down one more time, you can see that it's given you a link for your deployment. And this is the link that you're going to submit to me for your live site, because this is something that would work. Now, it sometimes doesn't propagate right away. So sometimes if I click on this, it'll give me a 404, but for the most part, it should work. One thing to note is if I go to contact and I go to show contact lists, I may only have one or none in here, because the local storage only works in relation to the specific page you're looking at. So if my page is a different page, here is an example. I already have some stuff that goes to GitHub, to durhamprogrammer.github.io. This is where I would store my local storage, and it's related to this part, Durham, like the DNS, right? So durhamprogrammer.github.io. If I go there, and if I put anything in my application, as an example, yours would be your username for github.github.io. That's where you could store stuff in local storage. You can see that it's different between my application here and my application on my local page, right? So this is my local page. You can see that application here shows a lot more, but on my online on Durham Programmer, you can see there's less. Why? Because I only entered one. So that's how local storage works, right? So we talked about that last week. All right, so that is just going back to this. We've got jQuery, and the way we did it was, if you look at our structure, we use yarn, which is an NPM. It's based on NPM, Node Package Manager, where we use our package.json to get the latest version of jQuery 3.5.1 by basically going out to the internet and installing it here inside of our project, so locally. But there's other ways of using jQuery. You can also download it and make your own structure, folder structure, where you download the code and put it inside here. That's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is using something called a content delivery network, which we talked about briefly kind of at the beginning. And a content delivery network kind of looks like this. This would be your centralized, if I had my server and it served up the same files to different clients, as a good example, right? Then each of the clients would have to download my version of the library every single time they went to it, right? However, if I use the content delivery network, chances are that you've already surfed a page on the web, gone to a page that has some of the libraries that I'm using. You probably have gone to a page that has Bootstrap. You've probably gone to a page that has jQuery. So what the content delivery network says is, if you have that the library, then it's most likely cached inside of your browser. And what this does is it makes the loading time a little bit faster. Now, beforehand, there was a difference between serving individually from our server to you. It took an extra couple of seconds before, back in the day, when the content delivery network was first came out. Whereas if you use the content delivery network, it was much faster back in the day, sped up access to your pages and your JavaScript libraries. Nowadays, I mean, the internet speeds have improved so much that you're not seeing a delay. If we think about this, guys, if we see a delay of 3 or 4 seconds on a page, 3 or 4 seconds, something is wrong with that page. We're like, wait, what's going on? Something's wrong with our page. 3 or 4 seconds, we have no time to wait. Whereas before, 3 or 4 seconds, that was the norm, right? It was like, okay, my page is coming up. I've accessed it. I'm waiting for it to come up. 3 or 4 seconds, we're all good. But now, if you wait 1 second, it's too long, right? So that's the things have changed. So, before, content delivery networks were huge, and even when we deploy things live, one advantage of content delivery networks is always going to access, kind of the latest version that's online. You don't have to worry about creating it locally, putting it up on GitHub, which, jQuery has been on GitHub thousands upon thousands of times. Who knows how many times jQuery is on GitHub? We don't need to put jQuery on GitHub again. It's not necessary. Same thing with Angular or any of the modern frameworks out there. You can use a content delivery network to do a lot of it for you, right? So that is a good reason to use it when your site is being distributed live, right, in a deployment setting, as opposed to locally, let's say, in a development setting. But even so, some people use this for development as well now. Actually, a lot of people. So this is what it would look like. You have a link, and if we look for the content delivery network online, if I look for something like Jquery CDN, if I just search for that, you're going to see different options. W3 Schools will support, tell you how to use Jquery, and it'll also talk about CDN with Google, right? You can also go to CDN.js, which is a very popular CDN or content delivery network host. There's many of them. And these the libraries in general are hosted across many different places, not just on one. So this is just a very popular one, CDN.js. If I go there, you can search for any modern library. For example, I want to look at Font Awesome. You can see the Font Awesome 5.152 is there, and you'll give the links to both the to the CSS. Here's all.min.css. This is a good example, right, where I don't have to download anything. I can just use the content delivery network to get the latest version, and it provides all the access that I need, right? Back in the day, there was a little bit of fear, I would say, when you're like, hey, if I'm accessing, the content delivery network, what happens if it goes down? Then I won't be able to do any kind of work offline. That's a problem. And yeah, if you're working offline, if you're on some kind of transit or you're on a plane, content delivery network maybe not the best way to do it, and you need a fallback, which is some local files that you'll have on your in your folder structure, and that's why I recommend it. If you shouldn't be limited to having persistent access to the web, although a lot of times we need it anyway for testing. So that's why I test with you with local files as opposed to using a CDN. But when we deploy live, CDN is the way to go, truly. All right, so that's the way I would do it. So there's an example of Font Awesome, and there's everything else. If you look for, you can search for, you can see React or Jquery. Here's Jquery, the latest version. You can see that there's different kinds of versions, Jquery Ui, Jquery Mobile, everything is available, and even other popular frameworks. If I was going to look at something like Create.js, which is a really cool canvas-based library to create games and special effects, you can see that a lot of this stuff is online, and I don't have to download anything at all, right? So really cool. And that's your, content delivery network. And again, there's more than just this one. There's other ones. There's one that's hosted by Microsoft, Amazon. There's a ton of them, right? And it's good because this way, you have, kind of mirrors everywhere of the same structure. Okay, so that's the content delivery network. So again, we talked about kind of the advantage of what jQuery can do. Let's briefly talk about, as we get into it, the first two things that jQuery does really well, which is something called, they do selectors and they do filters. Okay, so let's talk about what this would look like. So again, when we use selection syntax in jQuery, we use the $. We say, hey, jQuery, with a $. And then what I can do is very similar syntax that we would see in CSS, where you can use the same selector syntax to find objects or elements on the page. So example would be, hey, jQuery, $. Let's look at a selector to connect to something on the page. As an example, hey, jQuery, find all paragraph elements on the page. That's what this does. Hey, jQuery, find all paragraph. When I say all, I want you to think in your mind, it's some kind of collection that you're going to get. There's going to be a collection of elements that this is going to return. And even with a ID, it's going to find the first one, but it's going to make all elements that do that with the ID. Same thing with classes, all elements. So it's like a query selector all. That's what $ and then the selector is. The syntax right here is like document.query selector all paragraph. Same thing, right? So you can write it, just like this. So this is the JavaScript, would be something like document.query selector all, right? Query selector all, and then you put in the same stuff, which is the p tag. Okay, so that's what you've been looking for. This is the equivalent of this. So this is why people like this part, because it was shorthand for what this looks like over here. The challenge is that you're downloading and installing a library. So again, maybe thousands of lines of code, a few K, right? Whereas this is built in. So some people like to use this because you don't have to use jQuery, right? And that's what I talked about before. All right, so that is that's how it works, and we can go further with syntax. So you can do the same thing that you would do with CSS. So example, I want to find a paragraph element that is contained within some kind of element that has a paragraph element with an ID of text. I want to find a div element, as an example, all div elements that are adjacent siblings of H2 elements. So we're going to kind of find some kind of selector syntax to this. A UL that is contained inside, all UL elements on ordered list that are contained inside of div elements. So we can, the same kind of thing. And by the way, a lot of this is very similar to what we do with Emmet. Emmet actually used the same kind of syntax when it comes to scaffolding out HTML pages. So you can see that there's a relationship between CSS and the way we want to do things. And that's how jQuery is built. It's built upon the same selector syntax we would use with CSS. So if you're a CSS person, a front-end designer, then it becomes easier for you to use JavaScript because all you need to learn is just a $ and the same syntax to select an element. Now you have access to the element and I can do some functionality. Where it becomes a little trickier is using methods. So I have the selector, the .accessor method that we normally use. This is very C-like in terms of the way it's done, or even C++-like. .accessor method. Java uses the same thing, and so does C#, where we say whatever the method name is, and we pass in either parameters or some kind of callback function that goes in here, right? So, hey, selector, find an object on the page. Cool, now do something with it. Can we do it all in one? That's kind of how we do it with jQuery. You can also return the selector back into onto a variable. That's for sure. You can do that too. But remember what this is going to do. It's going to return a collection of objects. So that's going to be something different than you're used to. So here's some popular common methods that we've used. Val for getting the value, val with setting the value, text. Next, which is very interesting, submit and focus. So these are things that are very popular and very used all over the place in jQuery. Here's some examples of, notice that the var is still here. I've left it legacy. We don't use var anymore, but I left it in the documentation legacy because you're going to see a lot of this still out there. But you would replace var with let, of course, because we don't want to use var in our course. So example, gallon, if I wanted to get the how many gallons are contained inside an object with an ID of gallons, right? I want to get the value that's stored in that object, and I want to store it inside of the gallon variable, right? That's how I would do it. And again, I use Hey Jquery, find what I'm looking for, and do something with it, and return a value. That's what I'm doing, right? That same syntax is the way we would do it. And there's some examples here of how that's done. A couple really popular event methods, and we're going to focus the rest of the time this morning on these two methods. First of all, just on the ready, which, look what it says. It's the event handler runs when the DOM is ready. And if you think about this, take a look at what this looks like. This is a way of doing a much easier IFI in some ways, but it's not an IFI. And I want to talk about this, in a little bit more detail. So let's go back into our page. We're going to go into our in-class exercise now. And so what we can do, again, if I look at my app.js is, and let's talk about IFIs for a bit. This is the in-class exercise. So, so again, what I want to first talk about is the way that jQuery works. So now you should be able to go into your app.js and say something like, Hey Jquery. Okay, as soon as I say that, you can see that I get this $, and you should see in your Visual Studio Code where it says something like jQuery static. All right, so that's kind of the first thing. If I hover over this, it says the jQuery static. Just the $sign itself means something because I've included jQuery in my code, and it tells me a couple things. Right, I can do some kind of callback right away. I have 8+ overloads. Right, I can refer to the document by default. That is the default way of doing things. And then some kind of jQuery element that I want to, it's going to return a jQuery element, jQuery HTML element, right? So that's what it does. If you scroll down, it gives you some information about how this works. But $sign is the way we start. So hey jQuery. And then I want to open up brackets, and I want to type the word document. So hey, I want to go to the document, and I want to say if the document is ready. And you can see that document ready is crossed out. So that was the old way of doing things. And remember, we talked about it's been some things like this. When you see this, it's been deprecated. Some people say it's depreciated. It's not depreciated, guys. It's deprecated. That's the way we say it, deprecated. If I hover over this, you can see that that is in fact the way it is, deprecated. And it's deprecated since 3.0, right? So even the documentation we have in the PowerPoint, as an example, is telling you, yeah, you can use ready. And this would work, by the way, if you did this. And you could do it like this. You could say document.ready. And then inside there, you can use some kind of callback function, or what we call a handler, because the ready is an event. That's what it is, an event, right? So document.ready, and then I can put a callback function. Old school callback function would look like this. And now you can start seeing a pattern on what this looks like. So this is document.ready. Like doing an IFI, and we could do something like inside of the document, this little code, we could do something like console.log, and we can say something like document is ready, right? And just to show you that it's different than this, it comes before this. As an example, we can make it so that it is a little bit spaced out differently. Watch, we're going to change this up a little bit a couple times. If I go back to our web page, so we go back to our local web page, which is here. If I go to console, you can clearly see that document.ready or document is ready works, right? Because it's like app started, right? Cool, but what does this return? So if I allow it to be, if I say that, hey, let my document, right, or my page, we'll call it my page, because that's what it really is. My page is equal to this. I could do that, right? Because jQuery returns something all the time. It returns the document. That's what it returns, right? So here's my page. You can see that it's a jQuery document if I hover over. So what does this do if I save it? And if I go back to my console and I say something like my document or my page, I press enter, I get this. I get this, which is a funny thing to look at. So some kind of function, right, it says that's initialized for the document, and there's a document that's inside a document object in an array of the first element of the document array. I can maybe more than one document here. But right now there's only one document, and we can say we have access to pretty much everything in the document. That's what I'm doing here. When I hover over it, that's why it's flashing, because the document refers to, it's a reference to the document that I'm looking at right here, whatever I'm on. And I can go into the body and it shows me the body tag. That's what the body tag is. Notice that it doesn't include, it only includes the stuff that's inside the body tag. And I can do some kind of inspection. So anything that I have access to would be inside here. You can see that there's a lot of detail, like normal whenever you look at these console logs, right? So again, if you scroll down, there's a lot of information. It tells you when it was modified last for the document. And this is all something that is visible if I, kind of express this. One thing it does do is it creates a closure as an example, but I really can't return anything out of it. So I can't say something like, well, I want to return something out of this thing. I can't really do that, right? Not like I can do with a function like this. So this is good to get going, but it has limitations. Again, I don't have to write it with document.ready, right? It can be working like this. If I say I want my document, so how does it work? First of all, document. I don't even have to have the keyword document. I can just literally go, hey, I want this to function like this. This is the modern way of getting document.ready. So I save this now and I go back out. You can see again, document is ready. So this is another way of doing the same thing. See, I'm still getting a jQuery HTML element this time, not the whole document. So this is kind of something that I'm getting. By default, I am getting the whole document working by doing this. All right. So that is definitely one way of doing it when it comes to selection. So $ is like, hey, jQuery, and then do something. The other thing we can do with jQuery is I can target something on the page. So for example, if I know there's something on the page, let's take a look at my index.html this time. And on the index.html page, we have a, I want to target, let's say, this welcome to WEBD6201 H1 tag, right? So remember what I want to do. CSS syntax says I want to go to main, and inside of main, I have an H1 tag, and I want to get references to that H1 tag. So what I can do is in my app.js, I can do the same thing. I'm going to bring it up here for a second. I'm going to say something like this. Hey, jQuery, I want to get something that is, I want to look at the main element, and inside the main element, I want to get the first H1 element that I see, right? And let's say when I want to click on it, so if I type in the word click, now notice it says click is deprecated, right? Take a look at that. Click is deprecated, right? So it says, and then I can do a handler, let's do a function, right? So this is how it looks. I could do this. It's supposed to use on, by the way, but let's use the old way of doing it for a second. Let's do something like when I click on it, I want to do a console log. It still works, by the way. Clicked, which is like H1 clicked. All right, my H1 is clicked. There we go. And if I do this, this is another way of doing it. I can go to, it says, okay, uncaught type exception. It says app.js. Notice that we're in contact page. Do we have an H1 that's inside of a div tag? What if we go to the home page because we don't have that? Still, it says that there's a bit of an issue, right? So we're going to this place down here, and it says this is where my error is caught. All right, so let's see if this is the problem, right? And it's because we didn't put a semicolon, right? So cool. So we've got this, and now the way it would work is if I click on my element, my first thing, then we should get some kind of response, right? If I'm clicking, right? So that's the idea behind it, because that's how it should work. If I click on the H1 element, as an example, yay, it should work. It's not functioning. Let's see how it would really look at. First of all, I'm looking at anything that's an H1 element that's inside of a main element, right? So if I go into my index.html, do I have anything like that? Here's main, and then here's H1. So this is where I'm getting this element as an example. And the other way to do this, to check this, is inside of my page, my app.js, here it is. Let's do some output, right? So I can say that let H1 equal to this, right? And let's, as soon as this happens, this up here, remember that this is not in an iffy, right? This is not anywhere, right? So this might happen after the page loads. So let's put this inside somewhere we can get to it. So I'm going to cut this out, and let's go into our regular JavaScript where I say display home, and let's go inside here and put that little piece of JavaScript in here. So or jQuery h1 is this. As an example, if I hover over h1, you can see that it's jQuery element that I'm going to get, and I can try and do the click events. As you can see, that's what I want to try and do, and some kind of callback function. All right, so let's see how that works. So now if I click onto it, again, nothing. But what about if I want to print out the h1 element? So I want to say console log h1, right? So it's only going to be available in my home page, first of all, right? So only in the home page. I'm doing this now. I'm restricting it, and we're on the home page, so that should work. And then sure enough, here's where it is. So now this is where, you know, people may get messed up. So here's the h1 element, right? I can notice if I'm hovering over, I don't see the same level of control. I'm not getting the same h1 element that I had before, but I'm getting this h1. And if I scroll down, we want to get information about this h1. And sure enough, here's the inner HTML. So we see that this is, in fact, we are getting information about WEBD6201. It says lab 1, right? But our inner HTML says this. Why? Because we've swapped it out for something else later on. And that's why this does the same thing that it does. So we are getting access to this element. But the click function doesn't seem to be working the way we want. So how would we format this differently? Let's redo this thing and see what happens. So let's type on, and that's the new way of doing things. On, and then the event type, on click, and then the event handler. So now we do the function. This is the modern way of doing it with jQuery. And just do a console log again, if I can spell console, you know, which is h1 clicks. Okay, so let's try that. Again, this is the on click event, which is the way it would work. And we're targeting it here, and then we're returning a value here into this element here. Let's see what happens when we do that. So this is actually returning the element so we can inspect it. And does it work now if I click on it? So again, I'm still seeing this, still the same thing as we had before, but the click event doesn't seem to be functioning the way we think. And so can we some of you guess why? I'm targeting the h1 element. I'm trying to click on the h1 element, right? What about if there was a button on the page? Would it make my life easier to choose the button? Nicholas says it's unappreciated. Yeah. Appreciated, unappreciated. So this, I mean, it looks like this targeting this main element and the h1 element that's inside of you know, this main element, it returns this h1, this jQuery element. That's what it does, and that's why I can inspect it. Let's get rid of this for a second, and let's get rid of this. So we know it's giving us that. We're able to target that. What about if I did it a different way? What if I said an h1 element, all h1 elements? So that's what that is. Like target all h1 elements on the page, right? So that's what that does. Right, so if I go back and if I target h1 elements on the page, certainly that is an h1 element, but it doesn't seem that I can target that element at all, right? Same thing with the about page or the projects page or the services page. All right, so this is something that it doesn't matter which page it is. I can't click on any of them. But if I was to do it differently, and I want to talk about this, why, in a second. But I mean, I am doing what it's telling me to do, right? So this is an example of something that I'm clicking on. But remember, our page is loading when it's going to load. This is only for the display home page, first of all. It's not going to work for every page. So just the home page is where it might work. Display home, right? So not these other pages. So only here is where it's supposed to work, here in my h1 tag. Let's, instead of doing a click event, let's see what other events it can do. We can actually search for other events. For example, mouse over is an event, typically is what we can do. And we'll say mouse over h1 is what this is. So let's try and see what that looks like. Mouse over h1. So when I hover over h1, hover, this is my mouse over, if that's the typical event. And we can look this up to see what this looks like. If I save it and I go back over, then now what we want to do is we want to see this hovering over and getting an effect. If I do that with JavaScript, vanilla JavaScript, okay, here's the difference. So here's if I want to say document dot get element. We'll use query selector all, just like we did before. So we'll say, this is how it's done. Hey, query selector all. I want to target all elements that have that are h1 tags. Cool. And what I want to do with this is I want to add event listener to these elements, and the event listener that I want to add, right? Because it's the event listener that I want to add is the mouse over event, right? Or let's just add the click event. You can do this chaining that we talked about before, the click event. And I want some kind of anonymous function to kind of be in here. This is the same way that we'd write the above. This is a click event, right? This is the equivalent down here. I'm just writing it longer. So clicked H1. Let me see the difference though. Clicked H1. And we'll say jQuery. And then if we can make this go, just to show you the difference. And then this is clicked H1 JS. So we know it's JavaScript as opposed to jQuery. Let's see which one it fires, or if at all any. And let's see what the problem is. So jQuery all, selector all, we're going to get a document. This jQuery selector all returns a list of objects that we're going to be able to add an event listener onto. Let's see if this works on all objects, or if I have to use different syntax. If I hover over, it says, add event listener is not a function that works on query selector all. Well, it makes sense because this chaining that we can do with JavaScript or jQuery doesn't work with JavaScript. But what if I said, I want to look at the first element of my document? Can I do it then? Right. So if I go back now, and if I click on the element, we would try and think that that is something that's clickable. But again, notice that can't do anything. And if I was to get some kind of reference to this, so let's h1 equals to this, and let's output this h1. So console log, right, h1. My question to you is, what do you think is the problem here when it comes to this? So it says undefined, right? So h1, I'm saying, hey, h1, go to the document, query selector all, anything that has an h1 element onto it, and then do something with it. I want to look at h1 tags, right? But what if I just said something like a different kind of syntax, query selector, right? Or if I use something else instead of query selector, I wanted to use something like, and by the way, this add event listener kind of does everything in one line. Let's break it down into several lines. So we can say something, okay, I want, like we've done in the past, query selector all, I want to get an h1 element, or let's use all elements. So this is all elements that kind of reflects. It's going to be a node list of elements. And then I want to say h1 dot, right, add event listener, which is this thing. I want to add the event listener to the h1 tag, right? I want to add event listener to the h1 tag. That's what this is. So all h1 tags now is going to be clicked. And now let's load this one. Do I get anything from here? And again, I says that h1 add event listener is not a function, right? So even if I wanted to do this, so let's just go back, because this is all elements. So I can't do, you can even see that it's grayed out. I can do it add event listener, but it doesn't really work. But what about if I made it into the first element that's going to score a hit, right? So if I say h1 dot, and then I said add event listener, now that is going to work, right? Because I'm seeing that it's on a particular element, and we can see that maybe we're going to get something that's going to trigger something from happening. We can't target all elements with an add event listener unless we use a for each loop, but we can do it this way. And let's see what we're going to get here. It should be one single element that we get out. And sure enough, we get this element that we have access to. But can I click on it? Even though we see it's welcome to WEBD6201, I'm not getting any kind of clickable element. Why is that? Question for you is, can I click on an element, right? Like this, right? Or it doesn't need to be a button. So let's put a button on the page to test that, because we know a button is definitely clickable, all right? Definitely 100% clickable on the index.html. We're just going to add a button underneath the paragraph, All right, so we'll say that, let's just say it's a button, and we'll say my button. There's my button. I'm not even going to put an ID on it or anything. Remember, I'm not searching it out that way. I'm saying, hey, find the first button on the page as an example, anything that has a button on it, and I want to click on it. Okay, cool. So, cool, my button. Let's go into app.js only for the button now. We're going to click on it. So instead of H1, let's change this to my button. My button. Query selector all, we're going to look at button, right? So all button elements that we can find on the page. The first one, I'm looking at the first one. I want to click on the button, and I want to say clicked button using JavaScript. Okay, and this will output my button. Let's see, we've done this before, but let's see what the problem might be, right? If we did this, troubleshooting 101. Here we have a button, and it says, uh-oh, we have a button, but the button is this one, the one that is like way out in space, the one that is going to show this button, because this is also a button that comes up when I kind of close up my page like this. I have the hamburger, right? That is something that is generated by the page. So this, go back and put that back up again. So there's that. This is this, right? And that's the page that we have. So this is the hamburger. This is the button. So if I go to the console and click on it, then I should say click button JS, because that is the first button on the page, not the other button that should appear in my pages. All right, so that's the first button. Okay, so that is, even though index.html, I added a button that's in here, right? So there's the button. Remember that the button that I put in gets modified by my JavaScript. I add an extra element and all that kind of stuff. I wipe it out. I do a bunch of different things to the JavaScript container, and that's why it's not working the way it works. Because look, do I even get the button? So if I go back to here, do I even see the button here? Nope. Right? Why? Because JavaScript has already gone in and modified it. But I can click on this button up here. Okay, let's see if I can do the same thing with Jquery. So I'm using a couple things at the same time, and that's why we're not able to find that element. Cool. Okay, because the element that was found was deleted. We removed it, right, with previous version of our code. So this is cool. We want to click on a button. Let's see if we can do the same thing. So I want to target the first button, all buttons on the page, right? All buttons on the page, and I want to click the button with Jquery, right? And let's see how this works. I'm looking at a button element on the page. I'm clicking on the all buttons. It's finding all buttons on the page. That's what it's doing, right? All right, let's see what happens now if I do the same thing. So I go here and I click on the button. You can see both fire. The Jquery fires as well as the JavaScript fires, because this button exists on this page, right, as an example, and it's not been wiped out by our previous code. Okay, so that's how it looks on Jquery and JS, same thing, right? But the script is a little different. Look here, it says, I got to kind of break it down like this. And you can see that, hey, my button is equal to document.querySelectorAll. This querySelectorAll syntax selects everything. This, I don't have to do that. It just adds a click event to all buttons on the page, every single one of them, right? This is in one. This is where Jquery is faster. Is it better? Not necessarily, right? So that is the syntax that we have to use. So on click, on hover. Let's do an on mouse over. Instead of a click, let's see, whenever I mouse over a button, let's see if this works. So we'll say mouse over, and we'll see how that works. Mouse over button Jquery. So this is click button JS. Okay, so we'll go back. We've saved it. And if I go back and if I hover over the button now, you can see that my mouse over function works. As I hover over, my hand changes to a little, or my mouse changes to a hand, but I also get these events triggering on Jquery. So that's how fast it is. It works just the same. I just have to change the type of event here. Obviously, we can also do the fat arrow functions with both Jquery as well as with JavaScript, right? So that is the more modern way of doing it. Okay, we got a kind of a fat arrow function to do this way. So that is event handling and the way we've done things in selection with Jquery or JavaScript equivalent. Okay. again, not a great example, but a little bit contrived. And for your ICE in-class exercise should have this. Take a a brief look at this, whatever, or at least show me this, because this is showing you jQuery. One thing we want to use is we want to make a, just shifting out of this, I want to use the idea of having a namespace. One of the problems that we've had that I talked about earlier or last week is when we went to typescriptlang.org, right? I talked about how TypeScript makes, just like jQuery does, makes JavaScript easier. And if I go to my playground as an example, here I have an example of a namespace called objects, And you can configure your TypeScript playground to play around and to make nice JavaScript out of something that looks very nice, way nicer, which is TypeScript. So let's go into that. If you go into your tsconfig on the playground, just for a second, I can target what I'm looking at. So instead of my target being ES 2017, I can choose ES 2020. I don't care about React, and my module syntax will be CommonJS. All right, this is an example. And then I can get rid of no implicit any's. Let's get rid of all these things. These are just like checks to make sure that I get good linting. I do care about always making everything strict. That's important. But I don't care about any of these additional checkboxes. And this is kind of an idea of how we can configure TypeScript if we had it locally on our machine. Okay, so I'll close this up. Again, you can see that this is TypeScript and this is the JavaScript that it produces. And when I create a namespace, right, namespaces just don't exist in JavaScript the same way. But what TypeScript does for us is it creates closure. The challenge with using jQuery like this is it doesn't really allow us to return anything from our document ready. Just like we did before up here, if I said something like, hey, jQuery, as an example, I want to look at the document as an example. Here's my document. And instead of ready, as an example, I want some kind of, you can see that I can add something or whatever. I can do after, I can do Ajax, before and after. You can see that there's a lot of stuff here. The click is deprecated. A lot of stuff has been changed and deprecated lately, as an example, including the document.ready, which is here, right? And if you want to look at the modern way of doing an IFI or equivalent to waiting for the document to be ready, let's take a look at the jQuery API that's online. So go to jQuery. And I go to, to the first link here, which is the API documentation. And I want to do a search for ready, right? So I want to look at the ready handler and see how this looks. So this is, look, they even give document ready here online. We know ready is deprecated, right? You can also do it like this, right? So that is another way of doing, hey, I want to look at the document. These are all equivalent, by the way. I want to look at the document ready, but I can also do it just like this. So this is the recommended way of doing it, where I don't even have to use the document itself, and I can check to see if it's ready. That's what it does. Okay. So, and they give you some examples of some code, and I want to use a function, and I want to say when the document is ready, use jQuery again, and find a paragraph tag and swap out the text with something else. So that's what it would do. So if I wanted to do that, if I said instead of document, and again, I can use a function, right, like that, as an example. So a built-in function in one, that is like saying document ready. And then what about if I want to return something else? So if I go to something like here, let's say this is my document. Here's my document. And I did this again. Here's my document. And I want to return something out of it. I want to return, a variable. I want to return 10. All right. So, or I want to return an object that has my variable. Here's something we can do with an object. And let's make sure my variable is in quotations. Can I do this with jQuery? And the answer is you can do whatever you want with jQuery, but is it going to work? So if I do a console log now of my document, here's my document. Let's see what I get. So again, I'm going to go back to my home, and you can see that there's my document, but I don't have, a property like that is my variable. Even if I look in this thing, I can't really return anything out of it. So although it looks and feels like an IIFE because it kind of waits for the document to be ready and it's an enclosing function, doesn't act like an IIFE. So I probably wouldn't use it for that method. So if I wanted to use a namespace, again, and I wanted to make this the namespace, the syntax goes like this. So this is namespaces, and this is part of your in-class exercise. Namespaces look like this. I would say that, let's suppose my namespace is going to be called core, C-O-R-E. I would say let, up here, let core, right? So I declare the variable core. This is going to be my namespace. Namespace core, as an example, right? Well, remember that I have an IIFE, and the IIFE could be shortened. If you really want to make it modern, you can take away the function, and you can use fat arrow syntax for the IIFE as well. That is totally fine to do, as long as we make the fat arrow together. This is equivalent to a function, right, that we did before. So this is fat arrow syntax, right? Nice, nice, nice. And what I want to do with this fat arrow syntax is I want to pass in, this is telling me what the function is going to take. Right now, my function, my anonymous function, doesn't have any parameters. So I can take a parameter, and let's just call it core. This is not this. This is just a parameter that's local, a local parameter that's inside of this function only. Okay. On the bottom, the way we would change the IIFE, just like we saw up on Typescript, this part here that's part of the IIFE is the calling function. This is like me calling this function itself. So it's almost like saying, hey, call this anonymous function, the same one that I'm looking at. When I call any function, I can pass in parameters. This is where the parameters would be passed into. So in this case, I want to pass in a parameter that's been declared here. I want to pass this parameter inside of my function call, right? It takes a parameter. By default, my IIFE takes one parameter. I can pass it a parameter, and I can pass it core. Notice that it lights up. Or, all right, I can put it or, right, a pipe as an example. And by the way, if you wanted to see the syntax online, you can go to TypeScript for a second, and there it is. Or is a double pipe, so or. And then in brackets, core is equal to curly braces. So remember what this syntax is. It's basically saying, give me core, but if core is undefined, or if it's undefined, make core an object, an anonymous object. That's what I can do with core. All right, and I want to pass it into, way at the top, pass it into this thing right here, this function parameter right here. So this is where core gets passed into. So now that it gets passed into the function, it's available anywhere in this scope, this, kind of this purple scope right here, or whatever it is, this little mauve, or, scope. So it's in here, that's when that it's available. And what I can do is if I want to pass something out of it, then I can do the following. I can say something like, hey, core dot, and let's suppose I want to add something to it, like my start function. I can core.start. Remember, I can add a property to an object by assigning it is equal to start. And what I'm doing here is I'm taking a reference to the start function and attaching it to the core object, which I'm returning out. Why? I don't have to even use a return statement because core was declared here outside of the object, then I can use core here, right? So now that I've done that, if I go back to my, back to home as an example, and if I refresh, and if I go down here and type in core, I can get core, and I can say dot, and anything that I have that's part of core, I can get start, and I can actually call the start function again, right? Because I've access to it, I've exposed it or exported it outside of my structure. I can do that, and that is how we can use namespaces. The challenge is, and this is the last thing I'll talk about, the challenge is, what if I want contact to also be part of the core namespace? Well, I could declare core again here, but then because contact is kind of added before my app.js, so here, notice in the structure, I'm adding contact and then I'm adding app.js. I'm going to double declare that variable. I'm going to declare it first in contact and then in app.js. And some pages don't even have contact. So if I don't declare it in app.js, then it will be undeclared. That is a problem, my friends. And this is where we can make another little script. Let's make a new one. Let's call it, for now, and this is something we can do, we'll call it namespace.js. And namespace.js can have something like let core, which is really all of our namespaces, almost like a config file, right? That we include in all of our pages. We can say that namespace core, right? Just as an example. And then what we can do is we can include namespace.js in everything. So in about, we can go down here and include namespace before our app.js. Hear me out for a second. So script source, and we'll say /scripts, and then namespace.js. All right, this is something we can do. And the same thing goes with all the other ones. So contact list, go to the bottom of the contact list and put it in before contact. And same thing with contact.html, put that before the contact. And our index.html, we'll put it before the script tag, right? And make sure that we're saving all these, because otherwise they won't show up. Yes, yes, yes. And my project.html, we haven't really used this one yet, but we will. And we'll put that in there too, save it, as well as services.html. And we'll put that namespace in there too. So there we go. So there's services, products, all that kind of stuff. Yay. Awesome. Okay, that makes sense. So what this does, namespaces and app and everything else, it creates the namespace variable in here. It adds it to the, kind of my cache, and it makes it available that one variable. Think about it as a global variable that's available everywhere. All right. Okay. Positives and negatives. Positive is that when I go back to my app.js, I don't have to declare it here at the top because it's already been declared. I don't need to declare it. It's been declared, right? So that's how I know I can get core. And if I test this, right, by going out to my page again, and if I type in core.start, because I did that, then sure enough, I can still get app started. That's still the same thing, right? But where it really shines is because I'm using namespace.js, where the pages that include contact.js, I can wrap this in my namespace as well. So I can say something like, remember the ify, right? So I start off with an ify. Instead of using the function, I'm going to use the new modern syntax, right? So this is the modern syntax with fat arrow functions, right? And then the calling block, which is this part. And remember that this is where everything is going to live, right? Inside here, I'm going to take the contact class and encapsulate it inside of here. So this is going to be the container or the closure. But what I want is I want to pass in a function or a parameter that is the same as I passed before. So core, right? Or if core doesn't exist, then I want to make core equal to a an object. That's what I'm saying. Okay, so this is the structure that I'm using. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this entire contact class all the way down to the bottom, cut it, and put it inside of this new ify, right? But right now, if I did this, then I could never access my contacts because it's encapsulated. So what I can do is I can return it. I can say something like, well, I want to attach my contact onto the core namespace. So core.contact is equal to contact. And what this does is, if I can actually spell it properly, is it returns the class and attaches the class onto the core namespace. So now we have a problem because then every time I use contact, I need to use core.contact. So if I go back to my app.js, wherever I have contact, let's just search for it. There's my contact. Then you can see that here where I say new contact, that can't be done this way anymore. I need to use core.contact because I'm using the core namespace. All right. And the same thing goes with a contact list. I can't do a new contact. I need to do a new core.contact because, again, I'm using the namespace core. Where the advantage is when I go back out to my page and I type in the word core, right? And what you're going to see is I have two things, right? I have my start function, right? Here's my start function. Let's make sure that everything's saved. We're good, good, good. And if I go to my contact us page or my contact list, this is still good. This is still working. Why? Because if I type in my contact page where contact does exist, if I type in core and press enter, in my contact page, I have two things. I have my contact class and I have my start function. So I can pass out things or expose or export parts of my core namespace, and it's a container for everything else, right? So anything that I want to expose. So I want to say core.contact, right? I can do that same thing. I can say let contact is equal to new core.contact, and I can pass in my full name, let's say with my phone number, and then as well as some kind of email address, right? I can do that here on the here on the page, but I have to go through my core namespace. So core is kind of only exposing those things that I want. And then I can just do a contact dot toString to see what that would look like. There it is, core. And it's the same functionalities we would have before, but I'm going through the core namespace. So that is namespaces. And that is part of your in-class exercise today. Why namespaces? We're going to have lots and lots of JavaScript files coming up, right? And I think it's a great idea to encapsulate some of your code inside of a namespace. But the challenge is this: when do we declare the variable? Because this is just a variable at the end of the day. It's a container that has a reference to the core namespace. That's what it is. And if I declare it in app.js and in contact.js, I'm going to have a double declaration happening in some pages, which is going to cause a JavaScript error. And this is why we'd have something like this. If I had more namespaces in here, let's say, for example, I had an objects namespace, or if I had a networking namespace, or if I had something else, I can access those namespaces, and it will allow me to, I can list them all here. Any kind of global configuration, this could also be called config.js for my application. Any global configuration can be listed here, and you can also add additional information here in terms of documentation. All right, so that is all for today. I wanted to cover that part with you. Any questions around namespaces, how this works? Let me push this to GitHub. So again, I'm going to go Control backtick, make a new little terminal, and say git add dot git commit -m, and I'll say added for namespace git push. So you should have that now up on GitHub. And for the GitHub repo, just so that we're good, I'm just going to go into our repository for Durham Programmer and grab this ICE3B, copy it, and you should have that inside of your week 4 under your in-class exercise for submission purposes. I'm going to make a new link, create a link in here, and this is going to be the week 4 repo, right, or GitHub link. Okay. So that's for you. So you can actually take a look at that and compare my code to your code. I've noticed that some of you are not doing the in-class exercises. Guys, they're worth 2% of your final grade if you don't do them. So you need to get the in-class exercise done. They're so simple. Just follow along with what I'm doing here and submit. Take a couple screenshots and you're good to go, right? So that's all you need to do is basically your homework. It's practice. And if you don't practice, then when it comes to labs or tests or something like that, then you're going to not know what to do, or you're not going to know how to answer the question. So please make sure you practice by doing your in-class exercises. All right, so Nicholas says, I'm getting an uncaught type error. Core.start is not a function at, at line, it says anonymous 1.6, doesn't have a line where the error is though. Well, we know where that is. Core.start And again, I'll show you my code so you can see it. So if you look at app.js, first of all, I mean, I'm not sure if we want to expose the start method here, but this is what it would look like. For.start is equal to start. Start means this. For has to be in a someplace declared above. If it's not declared above, and if you don't have this syntax here below, then you won't be able to, you have to have the whole syntax. So the whole body is, when you look at an IFI, step one, we make the IFI, but at the top of the IFI, you need to take in a parameter, whatever that parameter is. Step two, at the bottom of the IFI, when we call it, this is the self-calling code right here, this little piece right here, we need to pass in two options. One, maybe core has never been defined, or if it's already been defined, then take the one that's already been defined. If it means anything, if it's not undefined. If it's undefined though, declare it as an object. Declare it as an object. Okay. If it's already an object, just use the one that I already have. That's what this is. Okay. Similar to a singleton in some ways, right? That's what this syntax is. And then once I've passed it in, I can use the local core variable, which I declared at the top of my IFI. This one. This is the local core variable. It says a parameter. That's what it is. This is a local core variable. And the local core variable is something that I'm going to use here. And the way I attach new parameters is I just assign them. As soon as I assign it to an object, it's created. That's how it works in things. So this is how it works. All right, so that is namespaces. And again, I added a namespace around the contact class, right? And we're going to add to the namespace. And the great thing about adding a namespace, and guys, this is a beautiful thing that I'm trying to show you here, is what you're doing is you're creating a small application programming interface. That's what you're doing, a small API with your own little library. That's what the namespace can do. It encapsulates your library into something that you want to expose. And you can expose only the functions and classes that you want to, and the rest you can keep hidden away, locked in, almost as private members inside of the structure, inside of this IFI. That is the beautiful thing. All right, any other questions before we move on? That's it for me, guys, then. I'll see you guys tomorrow. That is the first part of your in-class exercise. Tomorrow we'll do more jQuery, and we'll add more to your in-class exercise so that you have everything you need to submit. All right, guys, I'm going to stop recording now, and then I'll take any questions that people have locally. Thank you. All right, any other questions for